And I'm going to share my screen. And that's not, of course, what I want. Okay, it's getting closer. Here it is. Okay. I'm going to share this in the chat. This is the source sheet. Can I do that? Do I have the technology? Yes, I believe I do. So there you go. Okay. I'll take this here. Okay. So I want to start with a kind of ground zero here. And what I mean by that is to try to take all of the assumptions that we have about lots of texts, and because they're overinterpreted texts. So when you come to Genesis, it's a text that's, when I say overinterpreted, it's first of all interpreted by people like Milton. For me, my own experience is I'm getting to the point now where I get to Genesis and I understand it without Milton, right? But that's always my first look, because that's how I learned the story. But it's also overinterpreted in the sense that many of the midrashim, or some of the midrashim that I'm going to bring today, is stuff that you've heard, right? And I just kind of want to appreciate the extent to which the rabbis really are innovating, and they are, after the destruction of the Second Temple, recreating kedusha, holiness, through language. And part of that comes through the definition of the human. So really, what is the human? The universe that Jews inherit from monotheism is really, it's kind of a scary and terrifying one, because it's empty. The world of the pagans, read Thomas Mann describing Egypt in the time of Pharaoh. There's just so much available in terms of sight and sense and sound, images, things. And the second commandment is pretty hardcore, and it clears the path, or clears the way. So what's left? What's really left is the infinite God, and that really is important to remember, that the infinite God is the chidush of the Jews, a God that cannot be understood from one single human perspective, a God that whose essence cannot be exhausted ever. And the language about him, as complex and as rich as it can be, will always be a kind of commentary, meaning it never gets to the essence. So what's left is God, and then man. And we'll see that the midrashim, the writers of the midrash, very often talk about angels. I'd like your opinions on angels in a bit, but let's start reading Hamlet. Again, I'll tell you a little bit more about my own personal story. Itamar knows that my teaching, especially from the Renaissance, especially from Augustine, is really the history of modern individualism. And it starts in, let's say, Paul or Augustine. That's how I teach it. Starts in Paul or Augustine, goes to Luther, then to Hamlet, and then to Milton. Right? Let's see, that's the path. Of course, there are lots of interim places in the path. And I found there's something I think really exhilarating about the conception of the individual that develops in the Renaissance, and it comes to fruition in Milton. And I always thought, well, I feel so cut out of this because it's not my own tradition. And then people like Tikva and Michael and we got together and started to read Psalms, and we see that really David is at the origin of all of those, and it turns out that all of those figures that I just mentioned knew the Psalms intimately and wrote about them. Now, part of that story, so David is one part of the story of the individual, the kind of internal life. And in Medrash Rabbah, the collection of midrashim that are collected about the 4th century on Genesis, each one of the books is different. It's the rabbi's opportunity to talk about man. Now, the apotheosis of the human in the Renaissance tradition, let's give it to Shakespeare and not Milton, as much as I have a hard time with that, actually. But here is Hamlet describing the human. Let's just think about also what work Hamlet is doing. This is with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. There's a joke at the end, which is probably dirty, but I don't really get it. But we'll just read the main part. What a piece of work is man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form, in moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights, not me. So, tell me a little bit about Hamlet. I mean, what's Shakespeare doing here? Come on, Itamar. We'll practice doing pedagogy together. Meaning, really, I guess, and let me ask better questions. Since Aristotle, people are ask what is man? And here, this is one of Shakespeare's examples of doing that. Man is the political animal. Man is the person who speaks. Man is the person who contemplates, right? Now, Tikva pointed out to me before class that Shakespeare is riffing on Psalm 8, which is, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him. This is a verse attributed to the angels who say to God, why bother with man? Thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and thou dost crown him with glory and honor. And in the psalm, the angels are functioning to ask, why is it? Why are you allowing this non-permanent world to exist? Why are you introducing mortality into the universe? Plato is not useful here, right? Meaning the angels are asking, why create something in the realm of becoming? Let's remain in the realm of being. It's really a whole question that gets asked about revelation, about, first of all, the creation of man, but also revelation. So here, Shakespeare, I mean, we get really Renaissance enthusiasm, and the best Renaissance enthusiasm always comes with skepticism as well, right? As You Like It, for those of you who know that play, Rosalind is the heroine there, and what's great about her is she has all of the enthusiasm of falling in love, but also all the skepticism of a critic. She can do both at the same time. Hamlet is Rosalind's less functional cousin, right? But here we do have this sense of the exhilaration, again, that word, of the human. It's almost like the discovery of the human. But it's always undercut in Shakespeare. I mean, anywhere where it appears that it's in which it's interesting, it's always going to have to be undercut. Because if it's not undercut, there's something problematic about it. What's the verse also from Hamlet? The nutshell one. I really should know this one by heart.
I could be bound in a nutshell and be king of infinite space were it not that I have bad dreams.
Thank you. Right. So there, Shakespeare. One more time, Tikva, just one more time.
I could be bounded in a nutshell and be king of infinite space were it not that I have bad dreams.
Right. So that's Hamlet's sense of the inner world. And you see the same undercurrent, right? The same kind of this, it's like the expansion and contraction of the human at the same time. Okay. I want to talk a little bit today about Tselem Elokim. So there's a verse in the Torah The bottom one is the Geneva one, which I think is better, which I'll tell you in a minute why. Thus, God created the man in his image. In the image of God created he him. He created them male and female. You see why people can spend hours and hours working on Genesis, right? This verse itself is just doing so much. I mean, one thing that I don't want to focus on, but I want to mention at least here is creation dual or singular?
Probably two different versions later joined together by an editor.
Okay, yes. Well, who do you want?
Yes, but it's
Yeah,
left that way on purpose,
yeah.
right? Like they're merged that way and left that way despite the ambiguity.
Okay, so Itamar, we can make a gesture to you want to call the editor. What's the editor of Genesis? The J narrative or whatever. I'd prefer not to do that because it just interrupts my concentration, right? I'm looking at this as a text that has been accepted and read as part of a critical tradition for centuries, and and they see it as a coherent text, and I've said this before. That's our method here. V'yivra Elokim es Adam b'tzelmo Elokim bara oso zachar v'nekeva bar otam. So you see right there's a kind of ambiguity. Is it singular or double? Is it singular or plural? Bara oto, zachar v'nekeva bara otam. So built into that, and I'm sure you guys all know the medrash of the first human, the first man, Adam. Really, it is Adam. Is described as in the midrash as having two faces, du partsufo, right? And what's the Greek word? The Greek word is more well known, right? We see the female face and the male face looking outward. So it's in a way the way that the midrash understands things, and it's following from this verse is the human is a kind of metaphysical poem at its best. And what I mean by that, the human when there is a relationship between two people in which there is simultaneously unity, that is togetherness, but also distinctness, that's the trope that informs all of metaphysical poetry. How one thing can be two things at the same time. And how when it is two things at the same time, as we're discussing here, that's it in its ideal form, right? And they're getting it from this verse. Now, I'm inspired by Tikva's methodology of highlighting. I'm not sure I did it as well as she did, but what I tried to mark here are two chiasmuses. A chiasmus, you remember, is A, B, B, A, right? A, B, B, A. So here, let's look at the simple one. And the simple one is where the red, did I get this right? Right. Right. So the first one is green, yellow, green. Et hadam b'tzelmo b'tzelem Elokim. So in the center you have the tzelem, right, next to one another. And on the outside, and here there's a distinction, there's a difference. Normally we would expect with a chiasmus to see the same thing. But here there's an identity between the two outer parts, Elokim and Adam, that come together in the middle. It's very beautiful, right? Another way of looking at it is there's another chiasmus here, and here it's blue, red, red, blue. So here in blue, red, red, blue. Now, of course, I skipped the middle one, which I'm leaving black. There are 5 parts here. So the center now is B'Tselmo. And here we actually have the chiasmus, Elokim, Elokim. And now it's Adam B'Tselmo. It's almost like Shakespeare. It's almost like the text is trying to find the maximum, to find words that can be interchanged in the maximum different kinds of ways, right? And that reinforces this idea, which is this astonishing idea, which now everybody as interpreters will have to deal with this.
May I?
Yes, Tikva, please.
So, respectfully, I would like to disagree with you regarding the chiasmus.
Okay.
I think there's actually a three-way chiasmus, and the phrase et ha'adam is messing it up. It's interrupting, right? Because you have on the very outside, you have Vaivra, and then on the other side, you've got Bara.
Okay.
And then you have Elohim and Selim and Selim.
I hear
and,
you.
And man is stuck in the middle.
Yeah, I saw that also. I saw that also.
I think
right.
that reflects on when you think of the angels and God's infinity, as we were saying earlier, of like, well, why would you move from this world of being to this world of becoming? You know, in a sense, the man here is kind of stuck in the craw in the middle, very much as the Midrash describes.
Okay, good. Right. So we'll talk some more about it. I think, really, in halacha, they have to say elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, right? When there are two contradictory opinions, and they're both, so the bat kol, the voice from heaven, comes out and says they're both the words of the living God. We paskin like Beit Hillel or whatever, but they're both the words of the living God. In halacha, you have to say that, and Medrash, you don't have to, right? They're all there, right? And Tikva, you're performing in a way a kind of midrash. Okay, so in different places, Chazal are trying to explain. Well, let's actually take a step back before we look at Sanhedrin. What is the image of God? How do we even understand that?
Isn't there a inherent contradiction here with the idea that God is infinite? I mean, the very idea of an image kind of clashes with the idea of the infinity of God.
Yeah, that's right. There's the third bracha of the Sheva brachot. Take a look that up also. Talks about the image of God, and it does it in such a highly mediated way, like keeps on saying the image of the image of the image, just pushing it away as far as it can from the divine. Right. So yeah. We're forced by how do we learn this? We're forced by the text. What do we do? How do we learn it? What would you say? What is Tselem Elokim?
I guess maybe.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Itamar, yeah.
Maybe like a picture will tell them it's more metaphorical, it's not actually visual. Maybe it's about something like the faculty of reason or morality.
Good.
That's,
right.
I guess, something
good. You think like you should be happy. You think like a medieval philosopher, right? That's basically what they say, right? But right, and that it's interesting that we have the same intuition as the Rishonim do, the early Jewish commentators. So it has to be something non-visible. But again, the human then becomes a kind of revelation. And the human then becomes a kind of mediator between the angelic and well, the beast. We'll see that in a second. Actually,
I have the bracha.
Yeah, what's the bracha? Go ahead.
Baruch atah v'chulei. Asher yatzar et ha'adam betzalmo, betzelem dmut tavnito, v'hitkin mimeno binyan adei ad.
From whatever that was, he builds from it an eternal structure. But what are those four words again? It wasn't three, it's four, right? Can you read it again, Tikva?
Betzalmo, betzelem, dmut, tavnito.
Betzalmo, betzelem, tavnut.
Dmut,
tavnito.
Yeah.
So you see, I mean, this really just strengthens Michael's question, the extent to which this becomes problematic. Now, the rabbis understand that it's problematic. I wanted to just start with, talk about angels and the human. So, kach b'shasha bar Kodesh Baruch Hu esa Adam harishon tog bo malachi asharis ubiksha lomar lefanav kadosh. So, what happened at the moment that the Holy One, God, creates the first man, Adam? They made a mistake. The angels made a mistake. Ubikshu lomar, and they asked to say, I guess they asked God. They said they want to say kadosh. over the human. The story continues. Mazar Kodesh Baruch Hu, Hipil alav tardema. So he made Adam, he cast upon Adam a deep sleep. V'yado akol shu Adam, and they knew that he was just a man. God puts him to sleep. He's not eternal. This is what I was saying about going back to the ground zero. Like, who would think this, right? So what is the Medrash doing in claiming this? So we have these angels now, and they make a mistake because first, or from a different perspective, they don't want God to create man at all. From this perspective, once God creates man, they look at him, they look at man as if he is divine. You kind of have to go to Blake to find stuff that illustrates this. The Renaissance isn't even up to the rabbis, right? You have to get to like the 19th century to get the full sense of what the rabbis are saying. And in the paintings of William Blake, these are illustrations from Paradise Lost, interestingly enough. Talk about Midrash, right? Blake's illustrations of Paradise Lost, which itself is a Midrash on Genesis. But in Blake's paintings, you do have this sense of the divinity of the human. And that's characteristic of early 19th century poetry, romantic poetry in general, right? Michael, you know this, right? The sense in which the human is invested with these divine qualities. So interestingly, we go back to Milton, and it's in Chazal as well. This sense of the divinity and power of the human. Here's another one. Amar Rabbahu, Natal Kadosh Baruch Hu, Koshel Bracha Uverchan. So we saw that God takes a Koshel Bracha and he gives different kind of brachot to different people, different kinds of people. Michael and Gabriel were Adam's best men. That's not the real that's how I translated Shoshavini. What is that word? The wedding attendant. Shoshvini, yeah. We find that the Holy One blesses grooms, adorns brides, visits the sick, and buries the dead. So, again, how do we read this as not being just a children's story?
In what way is this a children's story?
I'm so glad to see you too. That's so great. I don't know.
The Torah is not for children.
Angels, I don't know. I mean, the angels coming and being Adam's best man. Here's another Blake illustration. This is not Gabriel or Michael. This is Raphael, who in book 5 comes down, holding his hands up in that bizarre way, and he's coming and visiting Adam and Eve. Same idea though, right? Again, and you have to go to Blake to get this sense, and you see it in Blake. The human and the divine almost identical. That also comes from Milton. And that also comes from Hamlet, and that also comes from what we're talking about.
I think it's worth pointing out. I took a brief glance at a concordance. The use of the word Selem to talk about Selem Elohim and referring to man as Selem Elohim is all happens before Noach's death. After Noach dies, the word Selem is only used to refer to idols. And I think this idea of like true images of God versus images of false gods, and I think there's something very interesting there.
So there is, and that's another talk that I really want to give, is exactly on this question. That is, how does Selem function? Meaning, Midrash, in a way, is a kind of tselem. It's an image, and it's a permissible image. I mean, Tikva, you brought up the idea that there's some images that are permissible and some that are not permissible. So, I mean, you could ask this question of Midrash, really, this is your question. How do you get away with this poetry, right?
Well, to build on that, one of the slamim mentioned before Noach dies is the idea that Adam has 2 children, right? He has Hevel and Cain. And then the description of the third son is that Adam has a child, B'tzalmo Kidmuto, B'dmuto Katzalmo, right? And the idea, I think, of having children that are like you and children that are not like you, and the idea of this of seeing ourselves and seeing God in other people could also be powerful.
We have Tiva, it's excellent. We have just a ton of data points now, right? And we just have to there's a lot to process. But I definitely hear you, right? And we'll look at another one which will give us even more. But let's look at this from Genesis Rabbah. Right. Rabbi Yeshua bar Nechemia b'shem Rabbi Chanina bar Yitzchak, Rabbanan b'shem Rabbi Elazar, Amri, Barabo Amma Brios Milamala, V'arba Milamatan. I was asking before, how do you not learn it as a children's story, right? Because to me, like, it's like, what are we talking? Angels? I still have the skepticism of growing up in the 1970s in a very, very reform community where angels, I'm not even saying, you know, especially in a Reformed Jewish community, we had special skepticism about stuff like this. How can you believe in this? I mean, what are the rabbis talking about when they introduce angels into this human space?
If I'm using the Blake painting, then it looks like Shoshvinav is like teaching Adam and Eve about sexuality. That's what I get from the picture.
Right.
Definitely.
Right. Right. So there is and in Milton, again, I said it goes back to Milton, there is a continuity between the physical and the spiritual. You'll remember that in Book 5 of Paradise Lost, angels eat. And Milton goes out of his way to say, this is not an accident. I didn't just make a mistake, because you're all going to think that I made a mistake, because angels are spiritual beings. That's really what happened. And for Milton, digestion is metaphysics, basically, right? That there is a continuity between physical and spiritual. And you're right, Itamar, to see that in the Blake very, very clearly. And also, you know, so much like when we turned against enlightenment and the dualism of philosophy, somehow we attributed that same dualism to all theology. And the rabbis certainly have nothing to do with that. The rabbis here, as you'll see, they emphasize doubleness, but singularity at the same time. Right. So here we are. Baraba Arba Brios Milamala, Arba Milamantin. So 4 creations, we're talking about the human again, and 4 from the bottom. Ochel v'shoise kuvehema, para vorava kuvehema, matil glolim kuvehema, umes kuvehema. So God created 4 creations from above and 4 from below. He eats and drinks like an animal. He procreates like an animal, excretes like an animal, and dies like an animal. Okay. So we see, thinking about dualism, I mean, now we're emphasizing the body. Umilamala omid kamalach esharas, midaber kamalach esharas, yesh bodas kamalach esharas, v'ro kamalach esharas. Okay, so there'll be a kasha. A question is coming up, but what are the 4 things? What are the 4 ways in which the human is angelic? And again, we ask that same question. When we say angelic, what does that mean here? Omid kamalach esharet, stands tall. Midaber kamalach esharas, speaks. Yesh bo das, dat or das is a very specific kind of connotation in Chazal. It usually means in Torah in general, it usually means to join things together. We'll just come back to that. Vora kamalach esharas, and also sees like angels. What's the kasha? Right? I mean, without even looking at the kasha, you can kind of figure out the kasha, right? No. And animals don't see, right? Animals see. And that's the question that gets asked. Et maha. So they don't see. That's the Medrash asking the question. Don't animals also see? Ella, and now we're going back to man, ze, the human, mitzaded. The human sees sideways.
I thought the mitzaded was being able to see in 3 dimensions.
Why would you say that?
Because to see it from the sides, right? You can see the sides as well as just what's right in front of you. You can see the dimensionality.
Right. Right. I love the word dimensionality. The expression in my mind's eye was introduced by Shakespeare, right, in Hamlet. That's the first time it's used. Those of you who have been to the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, this is Rembrandt's self-portrait. And if you look carefully, I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this painting. Really, maybe we just, in a second, just take 20 or 30 seconds together to look at it, right?
Can I say just one thing before we do that?
Yeah.
Metzaded, it also just means commends, or it's about giving value judgment, also saying this is good. At least that's what it means in modern Hebrew.
Okay.
Metzaded.
Okay. I mean, okay. I think here we're staying with from the sides. Anyway, as I said at the very beginning, I'm always seeing the midrashim through the things that I knew beforehand, like Hamlet and Rembrandt. And the rabbis obviously are using different kinds of languages. But just as Shakespeare's Hamlet has a mind's eye, you try to look Rembrandt in the eye here. And just as a kind of experiment, and just as a kind of experiment, to look, if you can, for a moment, just at this eye. He actually kind of gives you a little boundary around it, right? If you look at it carefully, it's quite strong. Looks kind of like an owl, actually. If you see it in Rembrandt, it's there. that's the Rembrandt motto. So to me, I have a special sensitivity to Rembrandt. When you go to this painting and see in New York City, you really cannot look at it for too long. He looks right through you. It's crazy. It's crazy, right? So it's like, to me, it's Rembrandt's third eye, which is exactly trying to express what Tikva was talking about, right? That is this being able to see things from more than one perspective. And Rembrandt, some of us have talked about this, is Rembrandt is the painter who tells you cannot paint. You must paint from more than one perspective. And in that sense, Rembrandt, as we mentioned, a neighbor of Menashe ben Israel, the most influential rabbi in all of Europe, he was instrumental in getting the Jews readmitted to England through Cromwell in the 1650s. He was brilliant. His strategies were amazing. He was also the teacher of Spinoza. In the novel that I hope one day to write, it's going to be about how Spinoza, Menashe, and Rembrandt meet at a coffee shop in Amsterdam. Coffee comes into Amsterdam, and I think it's 1606, and that's when it starts to spread, right? So later on in the 30s or 40s, they all get together and hang out and plot modernity together. Let's make the modern. Spinoza says, I'll take politics. Menashe says, I'll take toleration, which is bringing the Jews back into Christian society. Not a small thing, right? It wasn't a real toleration. And Rembrandt says, I'll take seeing, right? I'll do the heavy lifting, kind of like Shakespeare, right? I'll do the heavy lifting, meaning I'm going to teach people how to see in a democracy, because you can never see the whole thing. You have to see things from different sides, right? I love that one. Anyway, okay. So comes up in the discussion of the creation of the human, of the creation of man. There are, of course, there are two creation stories. People who are students of Rabbi Soloveitchik, like me, most know that Rabbi Soloveitchik turned these two creation stories into typologies of the human. The first one that we see first in Genesis, where man is a man of conquest, he rules over. And he's also really presented there as singular. The second story includes Eve, and it's much more based upon the communal. It's nice. I mean, to me, it's like, let's go back and see what the rabbis said. It's interesting that the Soloveitchik family, who are so against really midrash or poetics because they're so wedded to 19th century conceptions of logic. I see it in the yeshiva world here, very up close, that the brisk derech of learning, this idea that we're going to use logic, and I've seen it done. It's extraordinary, right? The people who are able to do this kind of lumdus, it's extraordinary to watch them. But there's built into it an extreme skepticism about poetry. And that's one of the reasons that nobody learns midrash at all in yeshivas. I sat in yeshiva for 15 years, and it was always like, so we get to a medrash, weiter, right? We skip it, meaning go on. We're going to keep on going. Because there's they don't have the ability to understand midrash because they don't recognize it for what it is, which is poetry. Yeah, sorry.
Is it that they don't have the ability to understand midrash, or that they don't want to understand midrash?
Well, so I think there's that built-in prejudice. What I've seen in the Jewish world is they're at the moment in Jerusalem, there are two extremes. One is like the halacha extreme. All we do is study halacha. I was in a shul the other day. There was like a 500-page book on the halachas of washing your hands and nitilas yadayim, a 500-page book on the shana mu'beret. You have these young kollel guys who are very, very smart and they want to innovate, so they choose something in halacha. The other side is a kind of the neo-Hasidic mysticism, which, so on the one hand, this resonates from Aristotle. Well, let's call the legalist the historian. Let's call the mystic the philosopher, right? And both of those err in the extreme. One emphasis on the particular, the other emphasizes the abstract. What saves the day for Aristotle? Poetry, because it actually does both, right? It makes the particular speak. Sidney, an Aristotelian, calls it a speaking picture. So there's the avoidance. People are they want to jump right to heaven. You can't jump right to heaven, right? You have to go through the world. And language and poetry is the way to go through the world. So the non-knowledge of how to read poetry in the world that I know as the yeshiva world it really takes the poetry out of life. Because in midrash you kind of learn that midrash it's not a poetic genre. It's a genre that teaches you how to read. It's a genre that teaches you how to engage in the world. Anyway, so here, and please interrupt me if there are questions along the way. So in this discussion, there is also a discussion of what is the soul. Chamisha shemos nikrala. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, yechida, chaya. Nefesh zehadam. So nefesh, the soul. So I skipped one. Nefesh zedam. So that's weird, right? How would you translate nefesh into Hebrew? Into English?
Spirit.
Right. All we have to say really is that the four words kind of challenge the way we think about things, or at least the names we give to them. Nefesh as dam, it seems that there's a part of the world of the spirit which is connected in some way to the body. And it's dam that does that. It's almost like the koteret, the incense in the temple. It's the means through which we mediate between the spiritual and the physical, right? So again, there are four names that the rabbis here in this midrash are giving to the soul. The first is nefesh, which seems dam, which seems to have a kind of physical aspect. Ruach, shehi ola v'yoredet. So ruach, I like that as spirit better, Tikva, right? Spirit goes up and down.
Nefesh could also be life force, because blood is likened to a nefesh.
Good, right. We said this once before, and I think what you're saying and what I'm saying, they actually complement each other, right? And here, neshama zeha ofia. Debriasa Amrin Hofiasa Tova. Like again, like very bizarre here. I'll translate it in a minute. So I'll translate it now. Neshama, and this is the third one. This is ha'ofia. As people say, I'm being gender flexible here, they say her ophia is good. The translation that I use, the Art Scroll, says ophia is dat, intelligence. Okay? Now, dat we mentioned earlier. Dat is the aspect of the intelligence that takes disparate things and brings them together. Now, neshama plays this role. It's an intermediate role between, on the one hand, ruach, which goes up and down, and then those other things, nefesh and chaya, which kind of go together. Nefesh is life force. What would you say chaya is, Tikva? It's kind of like your musculature, basically. It's your animal soul. That's what people in the 17th century would call it, right? Just the purely physical part of the body.
Right.
But it says שכל האיברים מתים והיא חיה בגוף. So how it lives on somehow even when all the members are dead, or is it describing or is it just the thing that makes the body not dead, like at the same time?
So this idea that the neshama fills the entire body, that sounds like Spinoza, doesn't it? The rabbis are all, and when I say it sounds like Spinoza, what I mean, and this the heresy of Spinoza was, I mean, aside from his heresy of looking at Tanakh, at looking at the Hebrew scriptures from a kind of anthropological perspective, Itamar, right? So Spinoza does that. But the metaphysical heresy is he argues for the identity of spirit and matter. So the natural world becomes divine. You can see why 19th century figures, Michael, would like this, right? Because it allows the human itself to be divine. And Chazal, the rabbis, are always kind of flirting with this. There's a story of Ben Zoma, a rabbi, and some other rabbi comes up to him and sees that he's in the middle of studying and is really kind of not of this world. And they ask Ben Zoma, "What are you studying?" And he says, "Ma'aseh merchava, the metaphysical mysteries of the chariot of God," right? And the other rabbi says to him, "If you don't tell me where the footsteps are taking you between heaven and earth, I will, push you down." And Ben Zoma says that he understood that there was only a hair's breadth between heaven and earth. And at that point, the other rabbi says of Ben Zoma, "We've lost him." Right? He goes crazy, right? Because this idea that the human and the physical and the spiritual come together, as Spinoza suggests, I mean, it makes God irrelevant. It makes the human divine, but if you're a monotheist, like Ben Zoma goes all the way there, it drives him crazy. Right. But let's go back to the neshama. So this is what you were reading before, Itamar. Haneshama hazu memala es kol haguf. This aspect of the soul fills the entire body. Ubishasha adam yashen, and at the time that a person sleeps, he olav v'shoeves l'chaim milamala. Here it's not the ruach that goes up, or it's the neshama itself. Rabbi Levi b'shem Rabbi Chanina Amar, al kol neshima v'neshima she'adam noshem tzarech l'kales labore. So we'll go back a second. At the time that the neshama is sleeping, it goes up and it kind of harvests or takes kind of the surplus from the heavens and brings them down to earth. Again, this neshama as this interim thing. I wanted to really look at this part at the end over here. Neshama ze ufia. So one way of learning ufia, as we said, is dat, something that brings things together. And interestingly here, we're getting the definition, and we don't really know what it means, and the Meforshim, the commentators, just have to kind of understand it from context. And part of that context is people say about it, oh, that person has a very good ophia. Another interpretation of what ophia is a little bit like ophi in Hebrew today. And it's described as the place in which, what is the ophia of a person? What is the style of a person? What is the outer affect of a person? It's that place in which what we consider to be intellectual or spiritual comes together or comes to contact with what we consider to be physical. And the neshama is that point in which I'm trying to explain it in such a way that I can visualize it for myself or feel it for myself. I guess in a counterexample, you know, people who are so repressed that their ofi is a lotava. It's not good, because you see there's some kind of imbalance between who they are intellectually and who they are. When I say physically, it's not just physically, it's like unconsciously. But how do you negotiate between the conscious and the unconscious? And that point, really, at that point, you can really see a person, how they balance those things, right? A great teacher balances those, right? And the two pshatim, we said one is da'at, and now I'm saying neshama is ofi, the way in which you see this coming together of the cognitive and the non-cognitive, and that makes sense more with the proverbial wisdom. People say, oh, that person over there, I really like his style, right? And it doesn't work as well with intelligence. There always will be, when we are learning pshat in Chazal or in Torah, there always will be, if there's more than one pshat, it's because the first one wasn't adequate, or there was something about it. There was a question that the first one doesn't answer that the second one does answer. Usually the second one does not answer the question that the first one answered, which is why we always say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, and we never look at these stories through only one lens. I mean, we do that when we're reading it, but we always keep in mind that there are more stories, right? And they combine together, so we have a complex sense of. And this is why, again, poetry is better than philosophy, because poetry can accommodate these multiple perspectives. Okay, so the passage goes on. Yechida, by the way, is the fourth, which is saying all three of the ones below are really just one thing, the emphasis on oneness. And the Medrash goes on and says, neshama warms the entire body so that he does not cool down and die. So the ruach goes up at night, right? That's what the ruach does. It goes back to its normal place. So I'm left without ruach. And the neshama, what keeps you warm at night? What keeps you warm at night? So it's the neshama here. Can somebody help me make sense of what this means? Why would this ophiata, whatever it is, why would either one of the ways that we've defined it as tziruf, dat, bringing things together, or a certain person's kind of style, why does that keep you warm at night? The two pshatim are very similar, you see, right? Because dat brings things together. And the person uses their dot to bring these different aspects of themselves together, and therefore, and we see that. There's an idea in halakha, in Jewish law, that you should learn at night, you should study at night. It's almost like maybe that's a little related to this, because when you learn at night, you are doing what the neshama does, which is it brings things together. Betzalel, who builds the Mishkan, is also attributed Chachma Bina Das. There's a medrash that says that Betzalel creates worlds, creates the Mishkan through joining letters together, right? This idea of joining. And that's what the neshama does. The neshama is, and that's Das, right? The joining of different things.
That's also Hume's idea of what creativity is.
Tell
Basically that.
me a little bit more about that, Itamar. What do you mean?
But being creative is not creating something out of nothing, is joining two existing things or ideas to make something new out of them.
Good. You have to go back to Addison, which is where Hume is getting it. Right. But cool. Right. No, there's and we spoke before about how the human is a kind of metaphysical poem, both two and one. Shakespeare's two distincts, division none. Right? That's Shakespeare's version of the metaphysical poet that the human is. Simultaneously two, Adam and Eve, but at the same time, one. So we were saying before that the neshama is what keeps us warm at night, because when you learn what you're doing is you're joining heaven and earth, right? And that's a shortcut, right? I know that's a shortcut, but there is something about the process through which we learn, and this is what allows the rabbis in their own minds to use midrash is a way of representing the eternal. It's a privileged way of representing the eternal, because midrashes say, I don't have everything. The midrash say, and the very thing that philosophers reject poets for is the reason that poetry is better than philosophy. Philosophers will say, especially analytic philosophers, that's not correct. That's not certain. That's a contradiction. Or that's only partial. And the Medrash says, I can only give you a partial truth. And that's why Medrash is a democratic activity, because you need more than one perspective to get at the infinite. Should we read one more thing? We have a little time, yeah? I really love this one. So what keeps us warm at night is what allows us to stay connected to those things that we consider to be heavenly. You ever have a really, really bad day and you come home and you just want to find yourself, right? For me, it's finding a place to sit and read a book, right? To reconnect to the parts of the things that I really value, and not to just be stuck in my physical self. So the neshama, that ability to join, that's what keeps us warm at night. For the coming attraction, that is what poetry does, right? It brings different things together. And the biggest different thing, and what midrash does, it brings heaven and earth together. One more text. We'll read it in English, yeah? It's mostly in Aramaic. Once there was a man in Sipori whose child died. Lo aleinu. Some say the father himself was a non-believer, and some say the heretic was who was a third party to the conversation. And some say the non-believer was a third party to the conversation. So we've got three people here. It's either two people or three people. Rav Yossi, fourth person. Rav Yossi Bar Chalifta went to the mourner, the father, to show him a comforting face. The non-believer, and now you have to read it both ways, the father or the third party, saw Rav Yossi sitting and smiling. Remember, Rav Yossi is Menachem Avel. He's coming to comfort the mourner, and he's sitting and smiling. And he asked him, again, either this father or this third party, the non-believer, why are you smiling? Rav Yossi responded, we trust in the Master of Heaven that you will see your son's face in the world to come. The non-believer, take your pick, father or the other guy, answered, is this guy's anguish not enough that you have to come and vex him further? It's interesting that in this story, the non-believer gets the best lines, right? We know the story here, right? Everything's going to be great. You'll see him in heaven, right? You should never be mourners. But if anybody says that while you're a mourner, you're like, can you please get out of here, right? So the non-believer gets a good line, and the non-believer, turns out he also knows Psalms. Don't you know the verse in Psalms? You will shatter them like a potter's vessel. I guess the the non-believer here is saying, when the human life is over, it's over. Don't tell me about the world to come. And guess what? I'll bring you chapter and verse. So Rav Yossi, so he comes up with this answer. Rav Yossi answered, pottery is created first through water, then fire. I'm not sure about the pottery stuff here, but I guess pottery you make with some kind of ground and then water as well, and then it's put in a kiln. Glass, however, is created with fire both at the beginning of and end. How do you make glass? A glass blower, right? The former, when it shatters, cannot be repaired, while the latter can. How can that be? The non-believer, frustrated, blurts out, glass is made through blowing, meaning it's something different. And Rav Yossi answers the non-believer, do you actually hear yourself? If something made through the crafting, blowing, inspiriting of the human can be repaired, how much more so something made by the divine craftsman? I learned this with my daughter, who's a therapist, because I think this is really about trauma. The previous part of the Midrash here talks about how God made the earth from afar, which is masculine, and Adamah, which is feminine. And why did he do that? So that his vessels, the human, would be durable. Whatever the masculine and feminine, you obviously can have men who have what the Chazal are referring to as the feminine, and women who have part of the masculine, but there's something that the masculine and feminine represent that makes them durable. We'll see that idea of durability comes through here as well. So I studied this with my daughter to ask her, really, can you overcome trauma? And the first part of the story seems to suggest that you can't. Right? And I think that has to always be the pashtut. That has to always be the simple meaning. That always has to be the default. Because and Chazal, the sages, the rabbis, they feel the pain of the mourner. And Rav Yossi doesn't, to my mind, come off great here. But let's learn his mashal in the way that he intends it. What's the irony here? The irony here is the skeptic says, glass is something different. It's made through blowing. And Rav Yossi says, don't you get it, right? There's glassware which is made through blowing, in which the human, here I think I yesh lo tekana, you can fix the person. Now I think yesh lo tekana, we know from Tikkun Olam, repair, you can repair the person. So here, when we read the entire story, there are two ways of learning we can repair the person. One is, as Rav Yossi says, you'll see your son in the world to come. But I'd much rather say about the mourner. I'd much rather say about the mourning, yesh lo tekana. He'll get over it eventually. Because the human is resilient. Before we read just briefly, what was the bracha that God gave to Jacob? Berchat avilim, the bracha of mourners. So the bracha of mourners, what is mourning associated with? Of course, moving on. I mean, mourning can go bad in two ways. One is you can fixate on the past and never leave it. One is you can not mourn at all and not deal with the past, right? Freud describes both of those terms as melancholy, bad mourning. But the Berchat Avalim is you deal with the past and you go into the future. Jacob, who is one of the Avot, one of the patriarchs, who represents nighttime, darkness, we associate him with Mariv, with not knowing, with exile. What does he get? The bracha of Avelim. You can go on. You can go on. Yesh lo tekana. God made the human in a way.
What is
God made
the bracha of the Avelim? The Mina Shamayim Tenachoma? That one?
I don't know. Good.
Where does it say that the bracha of Avelim is Yaakov's? Did I miss that somehow?
You did miss that. Well, I went over it very, very quickly. Here we go. Right? That brings the pasuk when God goes and visits Yaakov. Ma bracha baruchu Rabbi Yochanan Amar brachat avim.
Okay.
But,
Was
yeah,
it Bereshit Rabbah? Okay.
so the idea of consoling the mourner, and the consolation of the mourner means being able to move on. Yesh lo takana. We're very conscious of trauma these days because people experience it all the time. The resilience of the Jewish people has always been, yeah, we'll mourn. We'll get on with it. We'll mourn. We have no choice. Because trauma is arresting, right? Trauma, you stay in one place. You stay in the past, or your future is so uninformed by the past that you become a non-person. Because you're not dealing with the past. Not only represents the loss of the person, it represents the loss that's inside of you, right? And you don't confront that. So that's the bracha. We started out with the question, what is the human? Maybe just two things to emphasize as we end. One is this human ability to bridge things together. Neshama, dat, to take worlds that are different and to join them. I mean, that's what the human is. That's how the Medrash learned. The human is that joining, is that. I don't know if we understand better what Tselem Elokim, the image of God, means now. The more poetry you read, I mean, you would have thought that at the end of an hour we'd be able to define it better, but we've just done so much already that it's hard, for me at least, to harvest or to process, like, how do we even take these and come up with a nuanced perspective on things? But the last thing that I do want to emphasize is this idea of resilience, that we really, and I think part of the post-trauma of that we're living in today is we're refusing as a people to be resilient anymore, both on the left and on the right. On the right, when I say the right, I'm talking about the yeshiva world that I know. We isolate Torah entirely from the world, right? Again, that's in Jerusalem, and we keep it to ourselves. We monopolize it because we're so terrified of it being lost, because we almost lost everything. I mean, the trauma is real. And the other side is, this is really the kinds of bad mourning I just described. The Charedim is one side of the bad mourning, and the people who say, we can't deal with this anymore, enough, right? We can't, right? That's also a form of trauma. That's the mirror image form of trauma, not dealing with the past. And I think that is the resilience, and that why Berchas Avelim is so important. It doesn't get any better than this, right? We have to stop thinking that it's going to get better, and there's going to be some kind of state of completion. And even though we know from all the works that we read that there's no such thing as human completion, we still strive for it, or we feel the lack when we don't have it. And these midrashim are saying, when you feel that lack, that is what it is to be human. And so, as Yelena, we've talked about leaning, or you've talked about leaning into your vulnerability, leaning into your lack. Right. Itamar, were you at that class? That was an amazing class. Anyway, right, and we have to, that's part of, as Jews today, we have to go back and reclaim our tradition. And it means, in a way, reclaiming it from the people who say it's only theirs. Not because they can't have it, right? They can have it, but we can have it also. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, and I talk to you now because we have to be the leaders who are going to say, yeah, we are traumatized, but we have to move on. I know there are just 6 of us here, but Rabbi Akiva, I think, had 5 students after he lost the 24,000, he had 5 students. It's enough. Whether he started with 5 students or whatever, I don't know what the story is.
I think the correct response might be to process and move on.
Pardon, what is the correct response to that?
I think perhaps it's not just let go and move on, but also process. You have to process what you've been through and
Sure.
process your trauma.
For sure. No, but that is part of the mourning. Part of the mourning is to face it. Process.
Digest.
What, Itamar?
I said digest.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. And did anybody want to add any more comments or questions or share anything?
No, but thank you, really.
Thank you. All right, people.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
But it's
Thank
good
you.
to see you. And hi,
Thank
Rebecca.
you.
And
Hi.
hi. And Itamar, we'll talk, all right? We'll talk some more soon. Yalla. Thank you, people. Bye.
Chag sameach. Bye.